Hello there and welcome. I think we're going to call these events, for the time being, we'll see how it works, for such a time as this. This phrase has been ruminating in my mind since the beginning of COVID, and those of you who grew up in St. Louis School might recall where it came from. I'm going to count to 3. You have time to guess. 1, 2, 3. Esther. So let me begin by referencing an interview done with Krista Tippett. If you aren't listening to Krista Tippett's podcast on being, highly recommend it. I listened to a repeat of her interview with a poet writer whose name is Gregory Orr yesterday. Gregory Orr at a very young age, very accidentally, ended up shooting his younger brother on his first hunting trip. Kind of a rite of passage for someone who's grown up in the South. And well, we can't imagine how profoundly traumatic that was. And yet he has gone on to be a poet and a teacher and a thinker. And in the interview yesterday, the person he quoted really resonated with me. And so the name of the podcast was Shaping Grief with Language. And he quotes the Danish writer Isak Dinesen, who says, "Any sorrow can be born if it can be made into a story, or a story can be told from it." So it struck me over the last 3 months as I have been listening to what voice is rising with me, a voice from the Latin vocare, connected to vocation. So, like, who is the preacher when the church is closed? And then realizing all of my mentors and all of the lovely people I enjoy quoting and listening to and sharing with you, that coming to terms with the fact that at the end of the day, I am trained in helping people see the biblical text as a window to mystery and grace and gratitude and awe and grief and just about everything else. Why? Because it is filled with stories. And let's not mistake stories for history, right? Like, what's that saying? Did it happen? No, but it's true. So, that phrase, for such a time as this. How does the book of Esther begin? Xerxes, the king of Persia, is having this drunken fiesta with all of his friends. And, halfway through the evening, decides, I'd really like my wife to come out and dance for all of my cronies. And her name was Vashti. And so he summons Vashti and says, "Dance, woman." And Vashti says, no way. And so, well, you can only imagine what happened to Vashti. She got kicked out of the court. And so began the beauty contest for the new queen. At the same time, there was a man named Mordecai who was Jewish, who worked in the court. And he had a cousin, his name was Esther, who was absolutely beautiful. But it wasn't a safe place to be Jewish. So he said, I think you have a good chance of winning this beauty contest, but you're not to tell anyone you're Jewish. And lo and behold, doesn't Esther become queen? Then a bunch of stuff happens, and a really evil guy, his name is Haman, decides that he wants to get rid of the Jews. And so he creates this plot that, in fact, Xerxes, the king, goes for. And in the meantime, Mordecai's kind of freaking out and going, and so he sends a secret message to Esther and says, "Esther, you got to do something here. Otherwise, we're all going to be slaughtered." And Esther says, I can't possibly do that. You know what the rule is? I can't just ask to see the king. I mean, he has to summon me. And he said, Mordecai said back to Esther, Esther, who knows if it wasn't for such a time as this that you became queen. And so Esther pulls together the courage to seek out the king, and the rule at the time, the protocol was, if he were to hand his scepter to her, she would be allowed to visit him. If he didn't, well, that would be the end of her life. Well, the king loved Esther and so welcomed Esther into his presence. And Esther then put in place a plan to save her people that ended up being very successful. So, what about that phrase, for such a time as this? I think it's time, friends, that we wrestled with our sense of grief and imprisonment and sorrow and fear and anxiety, and that we go deep into whether it is our faith tradition or poetry that speaks to us, or an identity that is waiting to rise within us, or a calling that we have not been listening to forever, because the world needs Esthers who are going to think about those around them, those with whom they can make a difference, those whose lives they can change and make better, and get beyond all of their own fears to make that happen. And goodness knows, the world is in need of all of us to figure out what time it is for our gifts, our voices, our compassion, our generosity to rise. And for me, if you listened yesterday, somehow that day of Pentecost, when the Spirit just shows up and blows through people and gets them out of the tiny little rooms where they're hiding out and sheltering and staying safe, and yet at the same time barely breathing. Get them out into the community. Yes, social distancing, but this is where we get to be curious and creative and courageous. For such a time as this.